The beginnings of African slavery. The origins of the transatlantic slave trade can be traced back to the early 15th century, when European powers, particularly Portugal, began exploring the African coast. The initial interest was in gold, spices, and other valuable resources. However, as the demand for labor in the New World grew, Europeans turned to the lucrative business of human trafficking. The first slaves were taken from the coast of West Africa and sold to European traders, marking the beginning of centuries of brutal exploitation, raids, and wars in Africa. African societies were often destabilized by European demand for slaves. Raids, wars, and alliances between local leaders and European traders led to the capture of millions of people. The enslaved were often marched long distances from the interior to the coast, enduring extreme hardship. Many did not survive the journey, which became known as the March of Death. The survivors were sold to waiting European traders and branded like cattle before being loaded onto ships. The design and conditions of slave ships. Slave ships, often called floating prisons, were specifically designed to transport as many enslaved people as possible. Conditions on these ships were horrific. Slaves were packed tightly with little room to move. The stench, disease, and sweltering heat made the journey unbearable. The ships were equipped with shackles, chains, and weapons to quell any potential revolts. The transatlantic voyage, known as the Middle Passage, was a harrowing experience that claimed the lives of millions. The horrors of the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage was the most infamous part of the transatlantic slave trade, where slaves were transported from Africa to the Americas. The journey lasted between 6 weeks and 3 months, depending on weather conditions. Captives faced starvation, disease, and physical abuse. Many succumbed to illness or were thrown overboard, either as punishment or to prevent the spread of disease. The psychological trauma was immense, with many captives choosing suicide as a means of escape. The auction block. Upon arriving in the New World, the enslaved Africans were unloaded and prepared for sale. They were often force-fed and treated with oils to make them appear healthier. Auctions were brutal, with slaves inspected like livestock, and families were often torn apart. Plantation owners, merchants, and other buyers bid on the slaves, who were then transported to their new homes to begin a life of forced labor. The harsh realities of plantation life. Life on the plantations was characterized by grueling labor, harsh punishments, and a complete lack of freedom. Enslaved Africans worked from dawn until dusk, often in extreme weather conditions. They were subjected to brutal discipline, with whippings, beatings, and other forms of punishment for any perceived disobedience. Despite these harsh conditions, the enslaved people found ways to resist and maintain their cultural identities through music, religion, and covert acts of defiance. Slavery as the backbone of the economy. The transatlantic slave trade and the institution of slavery were essential to the economic development of the Americas and Europe. The labor of enslaved Africans fueled the production of cash crops such as sugar, cotton, and tobacco, which were essential to global trade. European nations and American colonies grew rich off the backs of enslaved people. The profits from slavery were invested in industries, infrastructure, and the expansion of empires, making slavery a global economic force. Acts of resistance. Enslaved Africans resisted oppression in many ways, from subtle acts of defiance to outright rebellion. They broke tools, feigned illness, and worked slowly to undermine the system. Some slaves managed to escape and formed maroon communities in remote areas. Others led revolts, such as the Haitian Revolution, which led to the abolition of slavery in Haiti. Resistance was a testament to the unbreakable spirit of the enslaved people and their determination to fight for freedom, the fight to end slavery. The abolitionist movement gained momentum in the 18th and 19th centuries, with activists around the world campaigning to end slavery. Abolitionists used pamphlets, speeches, and petitions to raise awareness of the horrors of slavery. Figures such as Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, and William Wilberforce became icons of the movement. Relentless pressure from abolitionists led to significant changes, including the 1807 ban on the transatlantic slave trade by Britain and the United States. However, slavery persisted in various forms in the Americas, necessitating further activism. The movement culminated in landmark events, such as the Emancipation Proclamation in the United States in 1863 and the abolition of slavery in Brazil in 1888. The efforts of abolitionists were instrumental in dismantling the institution of slavery and setting the stage for future civil rights movements. The long shadows of slavery. Slavery left deep and lasting scars on societies around the world. The brutal system not only devastated African communities, but also laid the foundation for systemic racism and inequality in the Americas and Europe. Descendants of enslaved Africans continue to struggle with the socio-economic repercussions of slavery, including poverty, discrimination, and cultural erasure. Despite the end of legal slavery, the fight for true freedom and equality persists, inspiring movements such as civil rights, Black Lives Matter, and calls for reparations. The story of the transatlantic slave trade is one of unimaginable suffering, resilience, and the powerful human spirit. It is a dark chapter of history that should never be forgotten, as its echoes continue to shape our present. The fight against the injustices rooted in slavery continues, and the lessons learned from this painful past guide us toward a future where all people are treated with dignity and respect. The struggle is far from over, but by confronting this history, we can hope to build a more just and equitable world.